So Rahul and me started working together about 12 years ago. We created a collective called Herbs, and we look at neighborhoods from the point of view of the people who live in the neighborhoods. So we have a kind of an ethnographic approach. We think that the main central part of understanding any neighborhood are the people who live in it and how they shape it. So we're really, really interested specifically in places which have not been planned, which have not been, let's say, created by architects, by engineers, but which have been shaped over the years by inhabitants. That's a starting point. So it's really bringing together anthropology and urban planning. And then within this, we go into many directions.
Yeah, so basically for us, it was also important to look at urban planning and the whole idea of design, architecture, that space as a space where we could apply, in a sense, in a more organic sense, a lot of the learnings from anthropology. So we saw urban planning and anthropology working together, and also the point of commonality was the notion of agency. That as when you often try to understand what neighborhoods and localities are, you realize that people are already creating a sense of what that neighborhood means, and that in the realm of urban planning, there's the official or the sort of more formal aspects of that try to impose a grid on that process. And that we felt that Matias comes from a tradition of urban planning where in fact agency is valued, and the best neighborhoods come from the point of view of more active engagement from residents and inhabitants. So it was just a very natural connect, because our impulses were very similar and we came from slightly different spaces, but then we felt that this coming together is important, both for the kind of intellectual tradition or the kind of practice we come from, as well as what we felt was a socially responsible space to create.
We met in Mumbai, and Mumbai, of course, has been a city which, from the point of view of our approach and our interest, was very interesting, because a large part of the population is living in neighborhoods that we call homegrown, which have been built from within. So we see agency at work at its fullest, collective, individual. We see initiative, and we see what happens when this is kind of the default way in which a neighborhood gets structured. So Mumbai, from that point of view, has shaped our practice. It has really informed us on what happens when people actually create their own neighborhoods. We know that historically it happened in many other cities, and we've been working a lot on Tokyo also before, which historically has been built incrementally after the war, and really also from within the neighborhoods. And Mumbai is a case study which is really interesting for us, because it's still ongoing, it's still happening. Of course, the difficulty in Mumbai, and also something which is interesting to us, is the kind of conflicted situation that these neighborhoods are in vis-a-vis the state, which always has this kind of idea of redeveloping, and decided that what is going on in those neighborhoods is not legitimate, that they should actually, that people are squatters. This is really something that we try to work against. I mean, this is more like, let's say, the activist part of our work, where we say that no, actually, those processes are legitimate, that those neighborhoods should not be dismissed as slum or informal. We said that actually what qualifies them more than anything else is constant organization at the community level and initiative. So we need to recognize those forms, and we need to recognize how they shape and that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with them.
In fact, one very important characteristic of Mumbai is the presence of community organization. People, not just as an abstraction, but people organize through community histories, through regions, with their language, culture, and whether we are talking about working class neighborhoods. I mean, Mumbai comes alive when we actually use that lens to see how people have organized themselves. And homegrown settlements, the kind of settlements where we are working from, which dominate the landscape, in some way also emerged from an older set of agency which existed even before that. So from the 19th century onwards, Old Bombay, Girgaon, Kalbadevi, all of those spaces and neighborhoods had the same impulses and processes. So for us, it is very important to locate, our present engagement also with what the history of the city has been, and to see continuities. And the point of continuity for us was the communities themselves. So in the sense that, what is generally known and spoken about the city of Mumbai is the fact that it is a city of migrants. Its genesis is really based on more and more people coming here to be part of the trading history, to be part of the history of docks. There was an older history, shaped by Portuguese colonialism, and then on top of that you had a new layer of a much more recent, relatively recent English colonial history, and all of that ultimately became a space for attracting migrant groups from all over. And these, these communities shaped a lot of the city's modern self-perception. That it was also at a time when the world was modernizing, was dealing with industrialization, and Mumbai never saw itself as sort of out of the global imagination. So it was always part of it. It had a huge flow of global migrants right from the 18th century, 19th century onwards. At the same time, it had a huge number of people coming from within the subcontinent. It was always part of a larger imaginary of the Bombay state. Definitely from the English colonial period onwards, there was a sense in which Bombay was not just the city; it was a region, and in that region, you had Karachi from Pakistan, you had Ratnagiri, you had Sindhudurg, you had parts of Karnataka. All of that contributed to the Bombay imaginary, and this flow of people coming and going. And this is very important for us because right from the start, we felt that the cultural diversity of the city is based on a dynamism of mobility and not just migration. Migration implies today a sense of a one-way, unidirectional flow. Whereas, what is more true of Mumbai and what we can see clearly embedded in so many of its institutions, whether it is the Goan Kuds or those dormitories meant for people coming from Mangalore and from Udupi, the restaurants themselves, fueled by labor coming in all the time from the region. That for us it was very important to talk about both migration and mobility and this flow and a larger imaginary which made Mumbai and which made Bombay. So that is something which we feel is very organic to the city. In the case of Mumbai and Ratnagiri specifically, the city was shaped a lot by the migratory flows from Ratnagiri in particular. So we came across Raj Chandavarkar's work and the whole industrial mill labor. Neera Adarkar and Meena Menon have written about it. And that meant that at one point of time, a majority of the textile workers were actually from Ratnagiri district at that time, which included Sindhudurg alone. And that a lot of the city's modern identity, particularly its socialist bearings, the trade unions, all of these were rooted in active connections to the villages. They were not necessarily, to be understood in the classical sense of becoming urban. And so many historians have talked about that. Our own observations saw when we, we're looking at BDD chawls, looking at neighborhoods in Bhandup, where a lot of the residents come from Ratnagiri, and then of course in Dharavi as well, seeing third generation residents return back to villages from wherever they come from. So this for us meant that that we needed to re-look at the processes of urbanization, which otherwise always look at a default model of a one-way street, which is a one-way destination towards the city. And this, as urbanists, as people who are looking at urban, practice and taking part in debates around urbanization, was very important because to imagine that the city has to be only visualized in a certain way, that it is only the form of of habitat, of modern habitat, and that the 19th century, early 20th century city should be the normative, is something which we felt needed to be questioned a little. And we felt that by talking about migratory flows and challenging the notion that the city is becoming crowded and dense only because of people coming to the city, is a slightly oversimplified argument. And then we began to understand what is happening in other parts of the world. We found that in many parts of Africa, many parts of China, they are called the dual household families, one household in the city, one in the village. We found so much of research from the 70s and 80s, right from classical sociologists saying the same thing, whether it's K.M. Kapadia, whether it is A.M. Shah, all of them talking about much more complex models, which never get reflected in our understanding of urban policy. Because urban policy is all about urbanizing and development and seeing one as the marker of the other and insisting that this is the way it is. And in fact, of course, a lot of it is true. A lot of that kind of urbanization is indeed the case. However, it is not the full story. And if it is not the full story, we needed to understand that. And we felt that, to talk about India as being, only 27% urbanized or 30% urbanized was a very reductive way of understanding urbanism, particularly in a context of, where there's so much of mobility of labor. And we also looked at the railways. The railway network is a very special network in India where a worker can travel across the subcontinent at a fraction of the cost what he or she would have to pay in any other part of the world, which means that this is definitely shaping the history. And of course, our Konkan study was complicated because the Konkan migration happened before the railways. So railways are not even needed for the mobility. So it was the steamer ship, it was the road, it was walking, it was. So we felt that mobility is a very intrinsic part of labor movement, of the way in which urban landscapes are shaped and changed, and that to talk in terms to talk about urbanization only as a demographic shift of people from rural to urban is just one part of the story. So all these elements came out in our study and research.
And at the same time, when we started our study, which was about 2013, 2014, we are aware that Neil Brunner, Christian Schmidt were starting to explore the concept of planetary urbanism. And they're drawing from Henri Lefebvre, looking at the world as essentially already urbanized. And so they're also criticizing this notion of the urban versus the rural. And their take on it was slightly more geographical. And they were saying that essentially that, and also it was also rooted in kind of a critique of capitalism, and saying that modes of exploitation of nature have been going so deep into the landscape that there's a road to everywhere. There's like a log road to every forest. There's a field being exploited, for consumption in the city everywhere. That ultimately everything is kind of like going back to the city, and that the city has very, very deep kind of networks going all over the planet. So we totally kind of agreed conceptually with the idea that yes, I mean the world is essentially urban, and in fact we also understood, as James Scott, that the rural is a subcategory of the urban. So that for us was also very clear. But we had a different take on it, because our entry point was not geographic, and also it was not through a critique of capitalism. The way we work is really by following the thread of people. So our work was much more ethnographic. We followed families. We followed families from Mumbai who were also rooted in the Konkan, and we looked at how they shaped the landscape, because we know that we knew very well that those families were representative of million others. We basically took very representative families who live in parts of the city where pretty much everybody comes from the Konkan coast. So we just saw that in the village where they were coming from, about pretty much all the families had half of their members in the city. So this is a prevailing condition. I mean, and we saw, for us, the interest was always to look at what does that do for the city, what does that do for the village, and what does that do for the family. And the big thing that connected everything was mobility. We saw that actually, I mean, there's a circulatory urbanism being generated through the movement back and forth of people, and the villages are part of this. They're already part of this urban world through the movement of people. So people go back to get married. They go back to reinvest in the houses. In fact, to build the dream urban house that they cannot afford in the city. So they go back to recreate urban lifestyles in the village, which they cannot afford in the city. They go back, for nature. They go back for many, many different reasons. They go back, of course, for community and for resources. But at the same time, they do also go back to the city because the city offers access to resources, income, education, healthcare, because there's another sense of community and freedom over there, and opportunity. So both places are equally important in a lifelong strategy of a family.
Actually, the seed of the exhibition was really another initiative called The Design Comes As We Build, where we were focusing on this coming together of live-work conditions in many of settlements in Mumbai. You can see that a lot of people work from home, and particularly in neighborhoods like Dharavi, there is a certain typology which we coined a term for, calling it the tool house, which actually is part of a large swath of Asian urbanist, Asian urban sort of maps all over. Tokyo has the home factory, in Malaysia and Singapore have the shop house. This is a certain typology which was recognized and validated. But here we somehow did not use a particular word to describe what we felt was an important description. So those tool houses became a point of a focus for us, which in a way talk about accommodation, where people can accommodate both working and living conditions in the same place. And so through a set of design initiatives, we began to work with local contractors, created models which caught the attention of the curator at Bhaudajila's museum, where the exhibition actually took place. And she was very interested in seeing where the story could go from here. And then we said, well, the story for us is part of a larger narrative around Mumbai, which involves mobility and migration, and the whole nuancing of the categories accommodation and housing was very important for us. We felt that the city actually has always accommodated different needs of migrants. So migrants are not just about people coming in destitution looking for homes. There are different kinds of migratory movements and different kinds of migratory, and it's very important to nuance those. The Mumbai Return exhibition also became a very important way in which we talked about both our Ratnagiri Mumbai story, and at the same time we brought in the typology of the tool house. And we brought in we had maps, architectural drawings of the chawl, but as a typology which is finding a new home in the villages. So we in Ratnagiri, for example, in a village, we found a person who had come back from Mumbai, and he was creating a new house for himself and for his family, and he used the typology of the Mumbai chawl for the different units of in the joint family. So we found that very fascinating, that there is something which the city is offering from a different history of accommodating different needs and different flows of people at different stages of their lives. And that while we feel that the narrative of housing rights and workers' rights is very important, in the city of Mumbai it was connected to the typology of the chawl very deeply. And the chawl is really something more than simply providing an individual a house. It is really providing a space for the whole village. I mean, sometimes the whole village would be literally packed into the chawl room, because it was a toehold for people coming and going. It was a way in which people could keep a flow going. This is very important for us. So the Mumbai Return exhibition in many ways actually had exhibits which reflected all these dimensions.
Actually, doing an exhibition at the Bhaudajila's museum was interesting because of the history of the place also, and the permanent exhibition which is there, which is really representing the different cast of Mumbai through a very anthropological colonial gaze. And so this is the legacy of the museum, and for us what was really important is to allow people to represent themselves through their own self-perception of who they were. So that inhabitant of Mumbai, that Mumbaikar, who is also rooted in his village, how can he himself, herself define his identity or her identity? So we done that through different ways. One of the way, of course, was the work we did with the local contractors in Mumbai, where we asked them to we asked them to design an ideal house, and then we presented models of this. Then also we asked people who were going back and forth to just share some pictures that they were posting on Facebook or Instagram. And so there's like a whole part of the exhibition is just their picture of the village. So how they perceive the village when they come back, and also the family in the city. So both ways. And then of course, yeah, this one part of the exhibition which was maybe the most successful in a way is when we asked the public, so the visitors, who in fact these visitors were connecting to the exhibition very spontaneously, because the exhibition was also representing them in many ways. And so we asked them to just put this little pin where the neighborhood is, and then connect it with a thread to another map which was showing where the village is somewhere in India. And it was amazing how through like just a few weeks, we just got all these connections between the city and the village, which was suddenly could be seen. And what was really really powerful with this for us is that, of course, it was aesthetically nice, but also that it allowed us to see something which eludes statistics. We cannot statistically enumerate people who are both here and there. How can you show this? And people are either here or there.
At one level, focusing on housing as if it is part of a provision which has to be given, which is also, which reflects, a broad socialist concern, is very valid, very important, and we in the state has to intervene. The point is that that when housing becomes something which is now part of an economic arrangement, where rather than the state, you actually now are subcontracting housing to be given out by builders, and it is connected to speculation and real estate development projects. Now we are talking about something else altogether. And so the thing is that in Mumbai, the residents themselves have always taken the lead historically. One of the first cooperative housing societies were in Mumbai. The city at one point of time, had much more elaborate arrangements of giving leaseholds, of creating rental stock, of encouraging people to build homes which could be given out for renting. And a lot of the city's sort of way in which it provided for both housing and accommodation, and we feel it's important to distinguish between the two, is related to a lot of active engagement of the residents in different forms. And it was not necessarily based on the fact that everybody needs to own property. The idea was that everybody needs to have a decent access to housing and accommodation. And therefore, rental stocks were very important, the whole process of providing rental. So in a sense, when we talk about the mobility and migration of people as a self-evident aspect of all modern cities, then the city starts to expand and open up space for it. It is not about scarcity anymore. But when the whole idea of housing is reduced to just providing individual units to people and to families, then you are also disregarding the so many other ways in which people actually organize themselves. And also it is now co-opted completely by the real estate and the builder lobby, who have sort of harnessed the need for housing into something which becomes capital for them. And this also happened from the 90s onwards with the whole SRA, moving away from self-development into builder-led development. So this is something which we feel needs to be unpacked and understood more systematically. A lot of people in the city have been working on that, and all we can say is that that there are so many different arrangements. We do not necessarily have. We must be careful that in the name of housing rights, we are privatizing land and privatizing housing. This needs to be questioned, because there are many ways in which there can be people can have occupancy rights, they can have secure tenure, they can have collective ownership of rights, they can have cooperative housing. All these models which were part of the city's history are all now being disbanded. So one has to be careful when talking about housing rights in a flat way.
Yeah, when we talk about when we go to the question of housing and access, um, we immediately kind of go back to this notion of the right to the city. Again, Henri Lefebvre, which is again becoming very popular now and lots very debated. And of course, it seems like the most progressive kind of notion, the right to the city. But we really have to ask the right to what exactly in the city. I mean, is it the right to housing? Because if it's the right to housing, then we enter a logic which is of mass housing, production of mass housing. In fact, this is really what a lot of very progressive, let's say, NGOs and activists have been fighting for. More mass housing, and the left is really strongly pushing for that kind of agenda, which in fact dovetails into a more right-wing agenda of just real estate, development and speculation generally. So for us, we just want to be a bit careful about this and say that the right to the city is a right to access, and is a right to opportunity, is a right to having the same opportunities, or at least a right to be able to develop an activity in the city, develop a relationship, which can be a productive one. So this is important. And what do you need for this? You don't necessarily need housing in the conventional sense. What you need is to be able to accommodate yourself there. You need a point of entry. So you need mobility systems which allow you to come, and you need a city which is welcoming to migrants, and at least on a temporary basis. And then yes, from there it can be a launching pad to staying, forever, moving with the family or anything like this. Or it could be a point of, of like, okay, I mean, if you can easily go back to the city, then you don't necessarily need to have like a permanent house over there if you know you can have this relationship. So yeah, the right to access and the right to accommodation for us is really, really important in terms of how we look at the city.
We don't see ourselves as representing larger collectives. We have also taken a position of creating a small independent space, which is essentially a practice-based space. So at the location of our office, looking at our work as an office, as a bureau, and where we provide whether it's design related, research related, services of different kinds and embedded in the neighborhood. Along with that, we feel that we are part of a dialogue, and we are aware that we also have research and we have other academic skills. All of these show a relationship to the neighborhood and community which is based on different levels of collaborations. So we can work with local contractors who are building homes in neighborhoods. We have worked with universities at the same time, or doing projects of design collaboratively, where students of engineering come and they work around us in our neighborhoods and apply different kinds of skills which they have learned. So our collaborations are really of different kinds, which reflect different projects and larger abstractions of communities and collectives, which we are fully aware are very have been a very important part of the discussion about urbanization, about how urban spaces operate, civil society organizations. We whenever there are interactions, we interact. But we are a little wary of using very large abstractions in understanding the context in which we are working. So we feel that neighborhoods are made of different. So of course there are organizations, for example, who are the Koli Jamaat, which is a kind of local residential fishermen's organization, which organizes itself as and it is engaged in building different kinds of projects. So yes, we have a relationship with them. We work with them very closely. So one of our colleagues belongs to a community of traditional broom makers, and he's part of our office, but there's also a connection which he has through his whole network, and therefore we have an engagement with that. So these are more organic ways in which we connect, and we are, it's difficult for us to say that we are and of course when we talk with the state, we are talking to the BMC representatives all the time. We have to design we designed a small space for women and children which had to be built on top of a public toilet. So to get permissions, we had to be constantly working with the bureaucracy and the locals. So in that sense, we must remember that there are different ways in which we can contribute and become part of, and while we understand and value the language, which looks at community organizations, civil society organizations through bigger abstract categories, there are also other ways in which people relate to collectives, in very particular terms. So we are, because of the way we are not part of larger, we don't see ourselves located in these abstractions. We have developed a network of collaborations of different kinds.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to this that it's true that being who we are, we cannot claim to be representative of any community or any constituency. In fact, the only thing that we can represent is diversity, because we're diverse, and this is our strength, and also our experience. I mean, because we work directly hands-on in the neighborhood, we do have relationship, which are and understanding, which are shaped by our practice. So that knowledge that we gain, this we can talk about, and we can talk about it confidently, because it's really something that we've kind of like this is really part of it has shaped our understanding and shaped who we are. So this is we can talk about, but we're really careful never to talk on behalf of other people, and this is something we learned very quickly in Dharavi, because I mean this is where we have shaped a lot of our practice, is that anybody who claims to talk on behalf of Dharavi, whoever that person is, is probably saying something which is going to be contested by at least half of the people in Dharavi. The diversity is the defining characteristic of that place.